This is from my sister Teresa. No poems on stolen land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on stolen land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on borrowed land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on pickpocketed land. I'd like to acknowledge we are on overdue land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on full land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on empty land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are trespassing on someone else's property, if that someone else had property, and if we are who we think we are and not, in fact, perhaps also someone else's acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the knowledge of like to acknowledge you like me acknowledging. I'd like to acknowledge I meant that. I'd like to acknowledge I meant to say we're on land that was empty when my grandfather moved here in, what was it, 1948? I'd like to acknowledge my Dene sister. I'd like to acknowledge my Gitskan brother. I'd like to acknowledge my Tsleil-Waututh cousin. I'd like to acknowledge my Nuchalnuth mother-in-law. I'd like to acknowledge my Squamish daughter. I'd like to acknowledge my Okanagan boyfriend. I'd like to acknowledge we are getting into dangerous territory here. I'd like to acknowledge that my grandfather moved here in, 1948, and then went back to Winnipeg, and then came out again with my grandmother and my dad. And I'd like to acknowledge I always hate it when I see the little items on maps saying IR30, but I also like seeing IR30, and it's usually in italics for some reason, because they acknowledge how their little space is marked IR30, both part of the cities of human habitation, which are on the maps and the landscape in time immemorial, blah, blah. I'd like to acknowledge the last 5 minutes of colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge 50 pages of post-colonial bibliography. I'd like to acknowledge the virtual res. I'd like to acknowledge the talking memory stick. I'd like to acknowledge the suburban res. I'd like to acknowledge the low res. I'd like to acknowledge acknowledging. I'd like to acknowledge the brass mask my uncle made at Reform School in the 1960s on Vancouver Island. I'd like to acknowledge the hot chocolate I had on army maneuvers on Squakale land in July 1980. I'd like to acknowledge both I can't acknowledge and I'd like to acknowledge Oka. I'd like to acknowledge 518 years, 4 months, 12 days, 7 hours, etc. of resistance. I'd like to acknowledge 10,000 years of resistance. I'd like to acknowledge the Freudian notion of resistance. I'd like to acknowledge British colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Canadian colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Musqueam colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Roman colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Norman colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Persian colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge Franco-Prussian, Sino-Nippo, Indo-Afro, Turco-Islamo, Togo-Pogo, Hawaiian Espresso, anyone who thought they could grab something, imperialism. I'd like to acknowledge cultural relativist imperialism. I'd like to acknowledge academic colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge activist colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge poetic colonialism. I'd like to acknowledge we are on bureaucratic land. I'd like to acknowledge drinking a glass of water 10 minutes ago and not having to boil the water first. I'd like to acknowledge the ice on the inside of the walls when I lived in Labrador in the 1970s as part of the military occupation of Inuit Indian land. I'd like to acknowledge not having mold in my son's room. I'd like to acknowledge hearing Elizabeth Gowdy talk about her autobiography and working trap lines in the 40s in Labrador in 1974. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on stolen Stalo land. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on messed up Musqueam land. I'd like to acknowledge we are on crappy Comox land. I'd like to acknowledge we are on sexually harassed Six Nations land. I'd like to acknowledge we are on fucked up Beothuk land. I'd like to acknowledge we are on incestuous Inuvialuit land. I'd like to acknowledge the triangles in the script and the toboggans in the script in the phone book in Goose Bay. I'd like to acknowledge the Ukpik Figure Skating Club. I'd like to acknowledge corruption in the Department of Indian Affairs. I'd like to acknowledge my word processing program just capitalized the I in Indian just now, and it did it again. I'd like to acknowledge corruption in the hereditary chiefs and band councils. I'd like to acknowledge corruption in the university. I'd like to acknowledge corruption in the art world. I'd like to acknowledge I was paid to say that, to write that. I'd like to acknowledge the $750 I got from VANOC and the check for which is in my wallet right now. I'd like to acknowledge that what I like about what I'd like to acknowledge is that it's about me, a sensitive liberal, a tough but sensitive radical, looking good, new t-shirt, do you like these jeans, they were on sale, are they too tight? They were when I bought them, but now I need a belt. Am I too old to wear this shit now? And what I'd like to acknowledge is that I don't like it if I drink too much. I'd like to acknowledge I was sober for 4 years and I'm not now. I mean, I'm not drunk right now, but I have the occasional drink, or maybe more than the occasional drink. But I'd like to acknowledge I don't like it when someone reads a poem about getting drunk or getting cleaned up and they've got the details about puking on their tits or that blinding feeling in their head when they're suffering the morning after. And I'd like to acknowledge this is getting way too personal, even for me. So I'd like to get back to acknowledging we're on stolen, native, indigenous, Indian, Injun, Skimo, Chug, Métis, First Nations, half-breed land. We're on native land, on native carpet, on native subflooring, on native foundation, on native weeping tiles, on native tarmac, on native sidewalk, on native dirt, on native leaf mold, the good mold, on native mud in our backyard, on native holes in the ground where our fence was ripped up by the landlord, not the landlord, guy working for the landlord. Maybe they were native, I don't know, I didn't ask them. We're on native highway of tears, on native land, on home and native land. And I'd like to point out that we are the ones doing the acknowledging, so you should give us a break. I'd like to acknowledge we're doing a lot more besides and could be doing a lot more besides. I'd like to acknowledge the acknowledging that we are on stolen, colonized, denied, dispossessed, unceded, ripped off, boosted, jimmied native land. Doesn't do a damn bit of motherfucking difference, and I'd just like to acknowledge that.